One woman turned her horse directly toward enemy soldiers to rescue her wounded brother. Another survived a massacre and then spent 11 years fighting the army that carried it out. Another became a war chief. Another commanded hundreds of warriors against colonial forces 2 centuries before any of the famous battles of the American West even began. And one of them never needed a battlefield at all. She picked up a pen. These women lived centuries apart. They belonged to different nations. They faced different enemies with different tools. But each of them became a specific kind of problem for the forces working against them. So what actually made them dangerous? That's what this video answers. Buffalo Calf Road Woman, Northern Cheyenne. Her brother was stranded on foot. Enemy soldiers closing in from every direction. Every warrior around him stayed back. Then Buffalo Calf Road Woman turned her horse directly toward the soldiers. She was a Northern Cheyenne woman, a mother of 2 in her early 30s, and on June 17, 1876, the only woman who rode out from the Cheyenne village to face General Crook's forces at the Battle of the Rosebud. Her brother comes in sight, had lost his horse under fire. She rode into the gunfire, reached him, pulled him onto her horse, and carried him out alive. The US Army called it the Battle of the Rosebud. The Cheyenne called it the fight where the girl saved her brother. 8 days later, she fought again at Little Bighorn. According to Northern Cheyenne oral tradition, shared publicly by tribal storytellers in 2005 after more than a century of silence, she was the woman who struck the blow that knocked Custer from his horse before he died. She died in military captivity in 1879, from diphtheria, far from home. She wasn't the only woman the Plains Wars turned into a fighter. The next one was transformed by something worse, a massacre. Mochi, Southern Cheyenne, the US Army eventually classified her as a combatant. That classification came 11 years after the event that made her one. On November 29, 1864, Colorado volunteer soldiers attacked a sleeping Cheyenne and Arapaho camp at Sand Creek. Approximately 200 people were killed, mostly women, children, and elderly. Mochi survived. Most of her family didn't. She spent the next 11 years fighting back, raiding, resisting, engaging US forces repeatedly across the southern plains. In 1875, she was captured during the Red River War, shackled in irons, and transported to Fort Marion, an old Spanish fortress in Florida being used to hold Plains warriors. She was the only woman among the prisoners, the only Native American woman the United States Army ever incarcerated as a prisoner of war. She died in captivity in 1881. The massacre at Sand Creek is documented. Mochi's 11-year response to it rarely appears in the same sentence. But Mochi wasn't the only warrior from this era to leave a record behind. The next one left a photograph. Pretty Nose, Arapaho, in 1879, 3 years after Little Bighorn, a photographer at Fort Keogh, Montana, captured something unusual. Pretty Nose stood still and looked directly into the camera. Her distinctive red, black, and white beaded cuffs identify her as Arapaho, an identification supported by later historical analysis of her regalia. She had fought at Little Bighorn in 1876 alongside a combined Arapaho and Cheyenne detachment. Her grandson, tribal elder Mark Soldier Wolf, later identified her as holding war chief status among the women of her community, an account he supported through personal testimony and the regalia she wore throughout her life. When Soldier Wolf returned from serving in the Korean War in 1952, she witnessed his homecoming. She was 101 years old. She had outlived Custer, outlived the wars, outlived the entire era. The photograph survived. The full story behind it almost didn't. But Pretty Nose fought alongside warriors. The next woman commanded them. Woman Chief. Crow Nation. She wasn't born Crow. Likely captured as a child from the Gros Ventre people and raised within the Crow Nation, She became one of the most celebrated warriors the nation ever produced. She led raids, built a reputation that earned her something almost no woman in the nation's history had held: a seat in the Crow Council. In a community with strict roles, she had crossed into a different kind of authority entirely. History never recorded her original name. The one she is known by was given by outsiders who had no framework for what they were observing. What she earned, nobody gave her. Running Eagle, Blackfoot. According to Blackfoot oral tradition, a public ceremony was held in her honor, one of the very few times in the nation's history that a woman received a formal warrior's name. She had earned it. Born into the Piegan Blackfoot band, she began riding with war parties after her father's death, taking on responsibilities that her community almost never assigned to women. Her success over time led to something even more unusual. She was eventually given command of war parties of her own. The name given to her at that ceremony, Running Eagle, had previously been held by a celebrated male warrior. That distinction was understood by everyone present. She was killed in battle, likely in the late 1840s or early 1850s. The next woman is different. The US Army fought her for almost a decade and couldn't stop her. Lozan, Chiricahua Apache. For years, the US Army could not stop her from moving through Apache territory. Lozan was a Chiricahua Apache warrior of the Chiheni Band and the younger sister of Victorio, one of the most tactically effective Apache leaders of the 19th century. She was also a healer and spiritual leader, someone who held military and ceremonial authority at the same time. When Victorio fled the San Carlos Reservation in 1877, she went with him. When he was killed in 1880, she continued fighting. She rode alongside Geronimo until his final surrender in 1886. Then came Fort Marion, then Alabama, then Mount Vernon Barracks, where she died of tuberculosis on June 17, 1889. In an unmarked grave, hundreds of miles from the land she spent her life defending. The next woman fought in the same Apache campaigns, but her most important work came after the shooting stopped. Da Teste, Chiricahua Apache, she fought as a warrior alongside Geronimo. But what made Da Teste impossible to replace was what she could do with language. Fluent in multiple languages, she served as interpreter and messenger during the negotiations preceding Geronimo's final surrender in 1886. She moved between US military commanders and Apache leaders, two sides that had been at war for years, carrying communications that each trusted her to deliver accurately. She lived until 1955, when historians interviewed her as one of the last living participants in the Apache Wars. She understood something the battlefield alone couldn't teach, that sometimes the most dangerous person in a negotiation is the one who controls what information moves between enemies. Nancy Ward, Cherokee. She entered the historical record with a weapon in her hand. At the Battle of Taliwa in 1755, Nanyehi fought alongside her husband against the Creek. When he was killed, historical accounts record she took up his weapon and continued. The Cherokee victory that followed earned her the title Gigwa, Beloved Woman, one of the most significant political positions within the Cherokee Nation. One more kind of power remains, and it came 2 centuries earlier than anyone on this list. Weetamu, Pokaset Wampanoag, 200 years before the famous battles of the American West, a woman commanded warriors against colonial forces in New England. Weetamu was the sachem, the political and military leader of the Pokaset Wampanoag people in what is now Rhode Island. When King Philip's War began in 1675, she led active resistance against English colonial forces. Contemporary colonial records, written by her enemies, document her as a military commander, controlling a significant fighting force throughout the conflict. She evaded capture for months. In August 1676, attempting to cross the Taunton River to escape pursuing forces, she drowned. colonial authorities found her body and displayed her severed head in the town of Taunton. She is one of the earliest documented female military commanders in North American history, and her name almost never appears in the familiar telling of that era. Zitkala Eshe, Yankton, Dakota. She had no rifle, no warriors, no territory to defend by force. What she had was a national audience, and the institutions targeting her people had no clean answer for that. She turned it against the system that taught her. Her autobiographical essays, published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1900, described the boarding school experience from the inside in her own words, placed directly in front of one of the most widely read national audiences in America. She co-founded the National Council of American Indians in 1926 and spent decades lobbying in Washington for Native American citizenship and political rights. That is what made her dangerous. 10 women, 3 centuries, multiple nations. At the start of this video, dangerous meant riding into gunfire. By the end, it means something different. The traditional story of the American frontier had room for all of this. If one name in this video was new to you, leave it in the comments.